Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to this next session of the Aon Insight series titled Respecting the Grey Swan. As most of you are aware, Aon has a strategic partnership with an independent research house called Pentland Analytics. Pentland provide advanced analytics and advisory services to the executive management of the world's leading companies. They convert puzzling business questions into mathematical models and translate this output into clear, practical recommendations. Following the commencement of the pandemic, Aon commissioned Pentland to provide some further research into the concept of what we call a black swan event. As many people were stating that COVID-19 was indeed a black swan event. The results that we're sharing with you today are based on 40 years of research and in fact provide a deeper explanation into the black swan, but also the grey swan as well as white swan events. And we'll prove to you today that COVID-19 was a grey swan event. Most importantly, the key findings of this research point us towards a key series of actions and behaviours that can assist you in managing your brand and reputational risk more effectively. To assist me in providing an insight into the latest research results from Pentland Analytics, today I'd like to introduce you to my colleague Julie Brennan. Julie is a client director with Aon Australia and is also responsible for Aon's M&A due diligence services. During her career, Julie has witnessed many corporate failures that have been triggered by some of the events that our research will be covering today. I'd now like to pass over to Julie to provide a brief 10-minute overview of the preliminary findings of the latest Pentland Analytics research. Welcome, Julie.
Thank you, Jason, and hello to everyone. It is a pleasure to be with you today and an honour to present Respecting the Grey Swan. We consider that more than ever, reputational crises remain one of the major risk concerns for any organisation. Our aim for this session is to provide insights into what a long tail or grey swan risk is and how you plan and manage these risks can have a significant impact on an organisation and its shareholder value. We have found that extreme events such as reputation crises are difficult to analyse due to limited and noisy data, but carry big impacts. Through Aon's partnership with Pentland Analytics, Aon has access to a unique database across 40 years of reputation crises and proprietary algorithms that can deal with the noise. The good news is that the outcome for companies depends entirely on the decisions that we make, both pre and post-loss. We have found that extreme events such as COVID-19 has renewed our interest in tailored work on black swan events. These are the unknowns that are inherently unpredictable. At the other end of the spectrum, we have white swan events, our regular, predictable events for which we have lots of data. In between, we have grey swan events, the topic of this presentation. These have been imagined and discussed, yet we remain underprepared. So white swans are the norm, predictable and preventable. Grey swans sit at the tail of our distribution. These are unlikely, but have large consequences, positive or negative. While black swans don't even make it onto the graph. By definition, they cannot be analysed using statistical methods. This is how we tend to think of them, scaled by the ease with which we can analyse them. Let's consider how COVID-19 is a classic grey swan event. We've been repeatedly warned with increasing urgency, and yet none of us were ready. Over the last 20 years, there have been a number of so-called black swan events that, when considered, are actually grey. In each case, the risk was anticipated, discussed, and warned about with increasing urgency. And in each case, we disregarded the threat, believing it to be too unlikely or simply too hard to get our heads around. So Why do we dismiss the warning so readily? This is especially relevant to grey swan events, where information is limited, noisy, and complex. Our brains need to take mental shortcuts to process the information. These so-called cognitive biases lead us astray when we are trying to make good decisions. From the analysis of all 300 grey swan reputation crises spanning the last 4 decades, they tend to fall into 7 categories. Of all the sources of reputation, grey swans, failure in governance and poor business practices are not only the most damaging to shareholder value, but are also the most common. So let's consider how many of these are insurable. Well, some speak for themselves, such as the property and aviation losses. You can also then look at product and service failures, where your general products and professional indemnity policies may provide coverage. And then if you consider financial and governance issues, financial products such as directors and officers liability, crime and professional liability will come into play. However, not all aspects of the loss would be endured or covered, especially the financial impact associated with share price movement. What I find of interest is the 13% for cyber attacks. If you consider that the data represents 300 events over 40 years, and cyber attacks are relatively new, but already represent a significant percentage, it will be interesting to see what lies ahead. So Jason, do you have any observations here?
Thanks, Julie. Yes, I do. It's interesting. Since we've been sponsoring this research from Pentland Analytics, we've seen a big increase in the number of cyber attacks that are actually now being put into our database. And probably the key observation I'd make here is that we think that's going to continue, that with the introduction of additional exposures, particularly on the malware side of things, that there's going to be more and more increasing frequency around cyber attacks, which becomes a crisis for many organisations. And as a result of that, it will have an impact, obviously, on shareholder value as well, which we'll cover in a few moments. So probably the key observation here, Julie, is that I think cyber attacks are going to continue to become major reputational and brand-related events, and they will become a more significant proportion of our analysis as we continue to build our research in this area.
Thanks so much, Jason. This chart shows the impact on shareholder value from the 2 groups of reputation crises. The grey line represents events between 1980 and 2010, while the red line represents events between 2011 and 2020. The x-axis shows the number of trading days in 1 calendar year, with the weekends stripped out. The y-axis is the modelled share price impact, the company's specific impact of the crisis, with market noise removed. It is clear that the impact of reputation crises on shareholder value has got worse over time. When combined into a single portfolio of 300 events across the last 40 years, the average impact is negative 8%, which is equivalent to a loss of US $1.2 trillion in shareholder value. Across the full portfolio of 300 crises, companies fall into one of 2 categories: 93 winners and 207 losers. We assess these depending on how well their share price recovers following 1 year after the crisis. Initially, all firms suffering from a reputational crisis tend to fall in value. However, within a few trading days, the groups diverge. The winners exceed market expectations as their management teams impress investors with their ability to deal with the unexpected. Losers disappoint investors, eroding their confidence that these companies can deliver them future cash flows. The pattern is significant, plus or minus over 20% in value. Losers outnumber winners by about 2 to 1, which equates to 93 winners generated 21% of value on average over the past post-year event, equivalent to US 1.2 trillion, whereas 207 losers experienced a symmetrical value loss of 21%, on average equivalent to US 2.4 trillion. This is a critical slide showing the key attributes associated with winners and losers. These core drivers have been honed over 40 years of study and provide a consistent guide to value recovery. It makes no moral sense to refer to winners and losers when considering events in which people have died. It is more challenging in every way to recover from crises where human lives have been lost. Anger and confusion among the bereaved, relentless attention from the media, and impatient demands from stakeholders all intensify the pressure on the organisation's leadership. What we have found in this communication must be more open, sensitive, action must be swifter, and repentance more earnest. Jason, do you have any observations?
Yeah, I do, Julie. I think for all of our clients that are listening to this session, this really is such a critical slide, because this really shows you the key activities and the key behaviours and habits that organisations need to practice in order to be a winner after a major crisis, versus those organisations that perhaps do not practice these habits and these routines, which unfortunately do not end up as winners after the crisis has actually occurred. And we continually come back to these management behaviours each year when we refresh and we enhance the research. And in fact, these key observations around preparedness, leadership, communication, action and change, in fact, do not really change very much. So as a golden rule, these are specific drivers of value recovery, should be known and executives should be well aware of them as they get prepared to be able to practice and rehearse for a specific crisis scenario, so that if and when it occurs, they know exactly what to do and when to do it and how to do it. So they would be my key observations, Julie.
Thanks so very much. Learning from our experience, we have utilised 4 case studies, all of which completed their post-event year being 260 trading days prior to COVID. The first 2 are both mass fatality events. Next, a ransomware attack on industry. And finally, a high-flying technology stock potentially derailed. The 15% growth in value impact illustrates the benefit of good old-fashioned commercial insurance. This chart captures the worst point in the post-crisis year for each company in terms of shareholder value impact. The data points are arranged in chronological order from the earliest crisis in the database to the most recent. Unsurprisingly, most of the worst impacts are negative. The average is negative 26%, and in over 10% of cases, a company will lose in excess of 50% of value at some point in the post-event year. 3 never drop below 0. We've seen that with Heineken, Nippon Meat, and Bank of America, while 4 lose in excess of 80% in value. Incline, Olympus, Ted Baker, and MNC Saatchi. To clean up the graph, these worst impacts are now arranged into a distribution curve, so all 300 crises had an impact of either more or less than 0. As you can see, the 4 companies we just discussed had in excess of 80% wiped off their value. We can learn more when we convert these numbers into percentages. As before, 100% of the 300 events had an impact of more or less than 0. Over half of them lost more than 20% of their value at some point in the post-crisis year. The distribution is understandably skewed, so just 26% were able to gain over 20% in value in that time. Finally, we see that in over 10% of reputation crises, more than 50% of the company value is wiped off at some point in the post-event year. The results of the research demonstrate that there is considerable value at risk from the mismanagement of grey swans. In particular, the value impact from reputation crises is significant and enduring. Reputation crises have become more damaging to shareholder value, and to recover strongly from them has never been more challenging. The likelihood of severe value destruction following a reputation crisis is greater than we might have thought. Jason, do you consider that the impact of social media and the immediacy of information becoming available is having an impact on these results?
Yeah, great question, Julie. It actually is, and we have done a previous study on that actually shows that social media, when you look at specific events in the last 10 years versus the last 40 years across the database, there's a much wider amplification of winners and losers. So those graphs you previously showed, if you just map out the last 10 years versus the last 40, you actually can see a much wider amplification. The lines on the outside, in fact, of the previous graphs that you've shown. So social media, because it's effectively not a 24/7 news cycle, it's like a 24-second news cycle, it's exacerbating and amplifying the impact that how a crisis can have such a significant result on an organisation in a very short period of time if the news going out is negative, and obviously it spreads very quickly. So it's a good question, Julie.
And I guess it reinforces the issue of being prepared and being able to take immediate action.
It does, absolutely.
Thank you so much. This table indicates the emphasis of risk management responses we have to each type of event. For black swan events, we cannot model them and predict them, but we can limit our exposure where possible and build resilience. Against our white swan events, for which we have lots of data that can be modelled, the case for investment in loss prevention is clear. For our grey swans, we can analyse what data we have and look for insights. We ensure our exposures where we can, and we build resilience for whatever the source of the next crisis will be. Jason, what do you consider to be the next grey swan event? Or should we be considering green swans?
It's a great question, Julie. So when we talk about green swans, we're referring to events or reputational crises that occur as a result of outcomes from poor ESG behaviours around things linked to a company from their environmental activities, their social activities, or their governance activities. And green swans are being actually is a term now that's been coined by the Bank for International Settlements to describe black swan events relating specifically to climate change. So green swans different from black swans due to the uncertainty around impact rather than incidents, and the potential impacts are enormous and existential, and the complexity of these events is obviously immense. So look out, Julie, for more green swans that are directly linked primarily to climate change, but more broadly to ESG practices as well.
I think the upcoming Glasgow conference will be very interesting as a result.
Yeah, absolutely. I think we'll see some interesting outcomes there, Julie, for sure.
Thanks, Jason. Grey swans require attention and investment. Without perfect knowledge and in a context of limited resources, we might focus on these three areas. 1, reimagine the risk landscape. Take a fresh look at the unlikely but substantial threat that we may previously have dismissed or glossed over. 2, acknowledge the seriousness of impact. Focus instead on outcomes and consider what decisions we can make now to place us in a good position later. And finally, translate understanding into action, foster a culture of responsiveness and resilience, and invest where necessary, informed by a better understanding of the potential financial impacts. We're now here at Q&A, and that concludes my part of the presentation. However, we'd love some questions. Jason, can you provide an insight into how the Pentland results can assist industry sectors? And perhaps what analysis has been done to understand the crises in the different industry sectors?
Sure, Julie. I certainly will. And thank you for that concise overview of the key findings from the research. It's great to hear some of those key findings. So let's dive into the industry insights now, as Julie has requested, because we've actually cut this data specifically by industry. And when we do this, there are many similar themes coming out of each sector when compared to the portfolio findings that Julie has just shared with us. So you'll see from this illustration that we have acceptable sample sizes across a number of industry sectors. So I'll provide you with a deeper insight into these now. So let's firstly start with the energy sector. So you can see, as I mentioned previously, very similar graph to the overall portfolio graphs that Julie just shared. So for the energy sector, you can see N equals 17, so 17 events over the 40 years of data. 5 winners coming out of this specific scenario of events, and actually 12 losers. The losers impacted minus 11% on shareholder value, which resulted in a loss of $179 billion. What types of events were these? Well, they were primarily fires, explosions, leaks and spills. They were also often fatal. So we need to be very sensitive when talking about winners and losers in this context, referring only to share price recovery. Some of the cases in this data, you're probably thinking, who are they? Well, Piper Alpha from 1988 is in this data, as is Exxon Valdez in 1989, that were both losers. And then also Deepwater Horizon in 2010, which included BP and Transocean. They were losers, whereas Cameron International and Halliburton, other specific crises you may recall, were in fact winners. If we dive into the financial institution sector, you see we have more data points here, 65 events with 18 winners and 47 losers. The losers accumulated a negative value impact of 22%, which equated to $586 billion. The types of cases that are included in this data relate to the financial crisis, the LIBOR rigging scandal in 2012, the Forex manipulation scandals in 2013, and the Australian banking scandals from 2014 to 2016. So they're all contained within these 65 events that we've been monitoring. If we dive into the food and beverage sector, you can see here we have 25 events with 10 winners and 15 losers. The losers created an average value impact of minus 19% on this graph, you can see, which translated into total value impact of a negative $157 billion. The types of events for this sector were primarily product recalls, but also a mixed bag of marketing blunders, financial irregularities and failures in governance and business practices. It also includes cases such as the well-known Perrier benzene contamination in 1990 and the NotPetya malware attack on Mondelez in 2017, both deemed losers, and allegations against Danone referring to the Aptamil baby milk formula in 2018, which was deemed to be a winner. If we move over to the pharmaceuticals and life sciences sector, this also includes biotech. You can see here from the 17 events, there were 3 winners and 14 losers. They were primarily product recalls and lawsuits, with a few failures in governance and business practices, and they included cases such as the Merck Vioxx recall in 2004 and the Bayer Roundup trial in 2018, both deemed to be losers, and J&J talcum powder trial 2016, which in fact was deemed to be a winner. Moving on to information technology, you can see we have 30 events here across hardware and equipment and software and services. 18 winners came out of this analysis and 12 losers. The losers had a significant total value impact on shareholder value, $170 billion. is what that negative 20% equates to in that graph. It was a mix of cyber attacks, not surprising for the tech sector, but also failures in governance and business practice. And it included cases such as the financial irregularities at Xerox in 2002 and the Cambridge Analytica scandal at Facebook in 2018, both doomed losers. And then, of course, the Samsung Galaxy Note 7 recall, that some of you may remember, in 2016, which in fact was deemed a winner. Its share price ended up higher than the share price at the time the event occurred 12 months later. We've also cut the data just specifically for cyber today, for cyber attacks, those 35 events that Julie made reference to before. From this, you can see there were 12 winners, but 23 losers. So in every 3 events that occur, 1 in 3 only is likely to be a winner 12 months after the event has occurred. This includes cases such as TalkTalk in 2015 and the Marriott in 2018, both deemed to be losers because their share price was lower 12 months later than what it was before the attacks occurred. And of course, Home Depot in 2014 and Cathay Pacific in 2018, both deemed winners. So this really explodes the myth that cyber attacks have no long-term impact on share price. So, Julie, I hope that addresses the industry sector questions.
Absolutely. It shows great insights, Jason. I guess my question is, how can Aon assist organisations in understanding their brand and reputational risk exposures?
Thank you, Julie. And just to wrap up the session today, we'd like to leave you with a few key messages. The first one is around how Aon is trying to assist our clients in understanding the brand and reputational risk. Brand and reputational risk forms part of what we call our big 6 risk exposures that you can see on this slide. We know our clients are really focused on these 6 specific risks at the moment. The work we do in this area around brand and reputational risk speaks to the relevance of insurance to the C-suite, who are concerned about brand and reputational risk exposure. Insurance alone is unlikely to get significant C-suite attention, but there's a huge protection gap that we know around what can be insured at the moment versus effectively what we need to insure, and cyber is a good example of that. I also would like to refer here to the Aon Global Risk Management survey, which has just been released or is about to be released just after this event, and only 10% of the top 10 risks in all of those risks that have been surveyed are in fact insurable. In fact, 25% of the top 70 risks are in fact only insurable. So there is, if you like, a risk protection gap that needs to be addressed here. So how do you actually quantify reputational risk and understand it? Well, at Aon, we have a specific stakeholder mapping process that we go through to build a reputational risk register and to make sure that critical stakeholders are aligned to the risks. We then go through what's called a bow tie analysis, as well as more detailed deep dives into sentiment analysis, what's being said about the company under the mirror, or a look that's looking in the mirror, as well as scenario development. And then we finally focus on financial costing to understand the financial impact that certain scenarios will have around a brand and reputational risk event, and the reputational quantification that needs to occur so that this can be understood by the organisation that's trying to understand their brand and reputational risk in more detail. So that's just a very short overview of how Aon is trying to assist our clients in brand and reputational risk, if indeed we're asked to explore it with them in more detail. So I hope, Julie, that addresses the question around how Aon is helping to assist our clients in this area. And that brings us now to the end of our session around respecting the grey swan. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for attending this session, which has in fact covered 40 years of reputational crises. We hope you find this information of use. We will continue to invest in this area to help our clients to have tools and insights that can help them to make better decisions moving forward. And if you'd like to receive a hard copy of these key findings, please send us an email via our On24 platform in due course. And then finally, Julie, I'd just like to thank you also for helping to share these results with our audience today for our Aon Insight Series Pacific event. Thank you very much, Julie.
Thanks, Jason. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you, everyone.